To God be the glory, great things he has done. So loved him the world that he gave us his son, who yielded his life and atonement for sin, and opened the life gate that all may go in.
Thanks for tuning in to No Trash, Just Truth, a podcast of Proverbs 9:10 Ministries.
With your hosts, Chris Paxson and Rose Spiller. Be sure to check out our other podcast, 5 a.m. Theology, available on all platforms.
And give him the glory, great things he has done.
Welcome back. We're still in the midst of our pre-Reformation tour of Europe. Last week, we covered a bit of what was happening in France and Bohemia before Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door. Today, we're going to look at some key figures pushing for reformation of the Roman Church from 3 more countries: Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Some of their stories that we're going to tell continue through the time that the Reformation was in full swing. We're going to tell the whole story because reform did not penetrate deeply into the societies of any of these 3 countries, because the Inquisition did a pretty good job of squashing it. And sadly, the Reformation did not have a lasting impact there like it did elsewhere. But there are stories of a few who did stand against the Roman Church, some who really risked their lives to do it.
We'll start with my ancestor country, Italy. In the early 1300s, Marcellus of Padua, who was an Italian philosopher, he was also trained in medicine, he became interested in the politics of the day. He became particularly interested in the role of the Pope and the Church having control over the government. Marcellus condemned the papacy, and he used scripture in some of his writings to do so. He argued for the independence of the lands in the Holy Roman Empire from the papacy's rule. If you remember, the Pope was given land, and they were their own state. But he didn't stop there. Marcellus elaborated on problems concerning penance, indulgences, crusades, pilgrimages, vows, excommunication, marriage, and divorce. And we looked at some of those last week, Chris.
Yeah. Marcellus believed that the Pope does not have absolute authority. He believed that Scripture alone has authority over and above the Pope and the Church. Marcellus even went so far as to state that the papacy was a man-made human arrangement, not something of divine origin. Many of his beliefs were later held by Luther and Calvin. As you can guess, Marcellus's ideas were declared heretical. He was excommunicated and he died in 1342, unreconciled to the Roman Church.
I'm pretty proud of my paisan there.
Yes, you should be.
This was right around the time that the Renaissance period began. The Renaissance period came right after the Dark Ages. If you remember, we said that during the Dark Ages, there was no new discoveries in science, there were no great leaders lifted up, there were no art. But the Renaissance changed all that. It brought new discoveries in science, like Copernicus's theory about the rotation of the planets. It brought new art forms in writing, painting, sculpture. And it brought the state-funded explorations of distant lands, like Christopher Columbus or Ferdinand Magellan. In Germany in 1450, Gutenberg rose up and he invented the movable printing press. Well, that allowed for improved communication and for ideas to spread rapidly. The printing press was just life-changing.
It was. The first Bible came sometime between 1453 and 1455. It was the Latin Vulgate, but it was amazing that the Bible was being printed this way. The Bible was the earliest major book printed this way in Europe, but it wasn't the only thing printed. Little-known texts from humanist authors were also printed, and they now reach the masses. And humanism was the popular philosophy of the day, but it wasn't the secular humanism like we think of today.
No, Nicholas Needham of Ligonier Ministries says this: we must not confuse it with today's philosophy of secular humanism, which is anti-Christian. Most of the humanists of the Renaissance were Christian humanists. Their commitment to human culture was generally part of their Christian worldview, which saw a God-given meaning and value in the present life as well as in the life to come. Now, he goes on to say that the Renaissance humanists looked back to ancient Greece and Rome, and they saw how much potential there was for achievement by humans. And this gave them a fresh optimism after coming out of the dark period.
Yeah. There was another attempt to loosen the hands of the Holy Roman Empire from the grip of the Roman Church. This time, it centered on a document known as the Donation of Constantine. This donation letter was a document the Roman Church claimed was given by the Emperor Constantine to Pope Sylvester I in the 4th century when Constantine relocated his capital to Constantinople. This document granted the Pope, and therefore the Roman Church, spiritual and political dominion over all of Italy, as well as over Jerusalem, Constantinople, and Alexandria. It also claimed that Constantine had bestowed upon the papacy supreme control over all clergy.
A document like this would have been invaluable to the Roman Church. No kidding. They could have used it as leverage for ruling over basically just about everything, both church and civil matters. However, despite the document's obvious value to the papacy, no mention of it was ever made, not for centuries, even when it could have been invaluable to use. It wasn't until 753, 400 years later, that Pope Stephen II saw an opportunity to gain lands back from the Lombards, who had just been conquered by Pepin the Short, who was the king of the Merovingian dynasty. And yes, Pepin the Short was his name. We don't know officially how tall he was, though.
I'm picturing him like my height. All right, so not long after Pepin conquered the Lombard lands, Pope Stephen crossed the Alps to have a meeting with him. It's believed that at that meeting, Pepin, who could not read, was shown this quote unquote donation of Constantine document. And so he submitted and handed over the Lombard lands that he had just conquered to the Roman Church. That was the first time the document was mentioned. There wasn't any pope before that who had used that document for authoritative purpose. Before that, no one seemed to even know anything about it. But after that, they did use it. Leo IX, who ruled from 1049 to 54, was the first pope to cite it as an authoritative document in an official act. And after that, subsequent popes used it in their struggles with the Holy Roman emperors and other secular political leaders too.
And if you're wondering why he turned it over so easily, if you remember, we said how powerful the Roman Church was. And all the kings and lieges and governors, they all knew it.
Yep.
So nobody wanted to mess with them. They were the
Nope.
mafia of the day, or the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Rome's opponents seldom questioned its authenticity. The first doubts about the document were voiced around the year 1000 by King Otto III, who wanted to see Rome ruled by an emperor, not the Pope, in both religious and secular affairs. He died of a fever before anything came of its questioning. Again, sounds like the Democratic Party. However, between 1439 and 1440, a man, Lorenzo Valla, who was an Italian Renaissance scholar and humanist, he wrote an essay analyzing the documents, and he proved it was a forgery.
Lorenzo Valla was a specialist in Latin translation. He argued in his essay that the donation document wasn't of 4th century origin like the Roman Church had claimed, but actually dated to the 8th century, something that would blow the entire donation claim to smithereens. This dating lines up perfectly with when the document first came on the scene.
I wonder if anyone compared the writing in the document to the writing of Pope Sylvester.
Yeah, gotta wonder, huh?
Valla's argument against it had other facets too. He questioned the legality of the land transfer. He questioned the wording of the document, saying it contained the word satrap, which Valla argued Romans such as Constantine would have never used. And as a specialist in Latin translation, Valla claimed that the quality of the Latin used in the document was undeniably poor, something that a document of this caliber would have never been.
Although Lorenzo Valla isn't a typical pre-Reformation reformer, his work is viewed as having helped the Reformation at the very least in a small way. Valid died in Rome and was buried. His tomb and his epitaph were last recorded being seen in 1570. What happened to it after that? In 1576, Pope Gregory XIII, a staunch believer still in the document of Constantine, had them both destroyed.
Chris, if you remember, with Wycliffe, they unburied his bones so they could burn them.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what they think that's going to do, but
they don't want you dead. They want you more than dead.
Oh, man.
There's another Italian pre-reformer that needs to be mentioned. When the Renaissance started in Florence, Italy, the heads of the Roman Church became huge patrons of the arts. The popes championed the likes of Michelangelo, who painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. They championed Da Vinci, who's best known for painting the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. And they commissioned the building of churches and cathedrals, some of the most magnificent structures you've ever seen. I've been to the Sistine Chapel. It's unbelievable. Yep. And as you can imagine, the opulence of all this enraged some in the church because there was a lot of poverty among the people.
Yes, there was. In 1452, a man named Girolamo Savonarola was born. Girolamo was an avid reader who was interested in theology. At the age of 19, he was jilted by the woman he loved, and he abandoned his medical studies to become an ascetic Dominican friar in the Roman Church, shunning all worldly things. He started to see the corruption and the wickedness in the world and in the church, and he believed that divine revenge was imminent.
In 1482, he moved to the city of Florence, which was under the control of the Medici family. The House of Medici was an Italian banking family that became a political dynasty. There were staunch Roman Catholics who were so powerful that within the next 2 centuries, 4 popes came from their family line, as well as 2 queens of France. They were so rich that they helped finance the construction of both the Florence Cathedral and the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica.
Savonarola was transferred to San Marco Monastery in Florence, where his sermons went largely unnoticed by everybody. Still horrified by the lack of religion and morality that was all around him, it wasn't long until he claimed to have been given apocalyptic visions. Whether he actually was given visions or not, he started using the apocalyptic imagery to terrify his listeners into believing his message of sin, punishment, and the redeeming power of Christ's love.
After he had been preaching in various cities for a few years, he was drawing big crowds and he started traveling around and he gained prestige. So Lorenzo de' Medici felt that Savonarola's presence in the San Marco Monastery would be good for the city of Florence, and he wanted him back. So Medici's money and connections to the Pope made it happen. Savonarola's terrifying apocalyptic sermons started attracting large crowds at the church in San Marco, and it made him increasingly influential in Florence.
In September 1494, King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy, intending to sack Naples. The city of Florence was threatened when Piero Medici refused passage through their land. To the people, it seemed like Savonarola's apocalyptic prophecies were coming true because war was on their doorstep. To keep the peace, Medici agreed to pay France a large sum of money and give up several towns in the province. The steep price offered for peace caused an uprising, forcing the Medicis to flee. Savonarola suggested a new form of government at that point, one ruled by a council of nobles.
Savonarola declared that Florence would be the new Jerusalem, the world center of Christianity, and to quote him, richer, more powerful, more glorious than ever. He instituted an extreme moralistic campaign, and Florence changed. The poor were fed, work was created for the unemployed, taxes were reduced, new rules were passed against immoral sexual behavior and immodest dress. The children even formed a sort of morality army, collecting nude paintings, wigs, makeup, games, dice, music, musical instruments, and they burned them all. Anyone who tried to object were forced by teams of Savonarola supporters to comply, and these supporters were called the peonies.
These fires under Savonarola's instruction is where the term bonfire of the vanities comes from. It means the burning of objects condemned by religious authorities as occasions for sin. One of Savonarola's famous supporters was Botticelli, who allegedly agreed to burn some of his own paintings. Savonarola's influence did not go unnoticed by Pope Alexander VI, who summoned him to Rome and told him to stop preaching. He didn't, and in retaliation, Pope Alexander excommunicated him in May of 1497, and he also threatened to place Florence under an interdict, something that would prohibit them from participating in particular rites or church services.
In April of 1498, a rival Florentine pastor proposed that Savonarola prove himself to everyone by walking through flames. Well, he refused, and that incited people to turn against him. Savonarola and two of his supporting friars were in prison, and on May 23rd of that same year, the Roman Church and civil authorities condemned, hanged, and burned the bodies of all three in the main square of Florence.
Savonarola's devotees, the Peony, kept his cause alive well into the following century. Pope Julius II, who was in office from 1503 to 1513, allegedly considered his canonization, but the Medici family, who had been restored to power in Florence in 1512, with the help of the papacy, of course, eventually had weakened the Peony movement, and it didn't happen. Martin Luther regarded Savonarola as a vital precursor to the Protestant Reformation.
Also on the Italian pre-Reformation front, Chris, was Peter Martyr Vermigli. And he was born on September 8th, 1499 in Florence, and he lived there for 63 years. And so he was well into the fullness of the Reformation. He saw the whole thing going on. Vermigli became a priest in the Roman Catholic Church, and he was part of a strict traveling monastic order, and eventually he was made abbot of a monastery in Naples, where he came into contact with a reform movement within the Roman Catholic Church. And this movement was called the Spirituality. He began reading about Protestant theology from people like Martin Bucer and Jörg Zwingli, both of who we're going to talk about in future episodes. Reading their literature was considered an act of defiance by the Roman Church. He was also influenced to move towards Protestantism by reading and studying the Bible and the Church Fathers, especially Augustine.
Reading the Bible will do that. It was around 1539 that he first started to come under suspicion of the Roman Church that he had reformed leanings, but Vermigli was very cautious, which paid off. In 1541, he was moved to a congregation in the town of Lucca, Tuscany. Vermigli set up a college there with several professors who would later convert to Protestantism. The city of Lucca was open to the ideas of Reformation. It was so open, it was called the haven for Protestants.
Yeah, it was called that until the Roman Inquisition was instituted in 1542 by Pope Paul III. That's when the authorities of the Republic of Lucca began to fear their independence was at stake. So at that point, they put bans on Protestant books that were previously ignored. Now they were enforced. Religious feasts which had been dropped were reinstated. Religious processions were scheduled, all to assure Rome of the city's loyalty to the church. Protestant citizens were urged to exile to Geneva or other northern cities.
The Republic of Lucca maintained intact without interference from the Roman Church, but the exodus of some of the major families in Lucca impoverished the whole city and its resources and its culture. Vermigli fled Lucca on horseback in 1542, defying a summons to report elsewhere. But he left a legacy of Protestantism in Lucca, with several important reformers also being influenced there. Vermigli also produced reformed writings and commentaries, and he had an impact on the English Reformation, which we're going to talk about in another episode, but he did that through his relationship with Thomas Cranmer, who was the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury and advisor to English Kings Henry VIII and Edward VI. So we're going to hear more about that later.
Several other Italian reformers were executed by drowning or being burned at the stakes in Italy, and this was all done publicly to assure the Italian population that was left with little doubt what would happen to sympathizers of the Protestant cause. Later, this helped the Roman Church in Italy to be able to prevent the spread of Lutheran or other Protestant ideas, unlike in Northern Europe. Chris, it's no wonder that the mafia came out of the Catholic Church.
I know. I mean, you've mentioned the Democratic Party. I've been thinking the whole time the same thing. It's just power and money and control,
Intimidation.
intimidation.
Yeah.
Yeah. The next place we're going to look at in Europe where the Reformation was not able to penetrate was Spain, despite the fact that it did have some brave early reformers who tried to change the Roman Church. It was around the year 1100 that the Church of Spain adhered to the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, although during the Middle Ages, there had been some who fled to Spain and proclaimed the gospel there, like the Waldensians, who we talked about last week. And all of those people were persecuted, or they went underground, or they were killed.
In 1492, King Ferdinand issued a decree that church and state should be united as one. And the aim was to establish a kingdom free of heresy. So this wasn't because of religious fervor. It was more to make sure that the confiscated goods of the heretics, who they deemed heretics, would fill his treasury. Here we go. Everything goes back to money.
Yep.
King Ferdinand expelled all Jews and Muslims and reorganized the Inquisition to make it more effective and more ruthless. The Reformation began in earnest in other parts of the world, and in 1516, Ferdinand's grandson, Emperor Charles V, came to power. Besides Spain, Charles V ruled over Germany and Holland as well as part of the Americas. And he broadened his father's anti-Protestant politics.
In 1519, Johannes Froben, a German printer from Basel, shipped a collection of tracts written by Martin Luther to Spain. They were printed in Latin, making only the educated able to read them. But the following year, in 1520, a Spanish translation was printed of Martin Luther's commentary of Paul's epistle to the Galatians. This was followed by translations of other works of Martin Luther, and Spanish merchants had these books imported to Spain.
One of the significant Reformation figures in Spain was Juan de Valdez. He was born in 1490, and in the 1520s, he came in contact with the writing of Erasmus. Erasmus was a leading figure in the Renaissance who edited the New Testament and studied the Church Fathers. He also studied the teachings of Martin Luther, who had already nailed his 95 Thesis to the door by that time. Matter of fact, Martin Luther and Erasmus had a lot of back and forth between each other.
Well, in 1529, Valdez wrote a book called The Dialogue of Christian Doctrine, attacking the corruptions of the Roman Church. It was immediately confiscated and put on the list of prohibited books by the Inquisition, who immediately put him on their hit list. Valdez also wrote on the doctrines of justification by faith, regeneration by the Holy Spirit, and the assurance of salvation. Valdez left Spain for Italy, where he came in contact with Peter Martyr Vermigli, who we just talked about. Back in Spain, all copies of Valdez's books were being collected and destroyed. However, one copy made it to Portugal, and it's the only surviving copy of that original printing.
They needed someone like Elon Musk to start a platform like X where you could say what you wanted and weren't censored.
They did.
Another Spanish reformer was Juan Perez de Pineda. Pineda left Spain and he worked in Rome for Emperor Charles V from 1527 to 1530. He eventually went back to Spain and started working on a translation of the Greek New Testament into Spanish. When he was found out, he fled to Geneva, Switzerland to escape the Inquisition. His Spanish New Testament was published in Geneva in 1556.
The title page of Pineda's New Testament has a large Y on it. He made it that way because the two arms of the Y represent two destinies. As you look at the Y, one arm is wider because wide is the way and wide is the gate that leads to destruction. The other arm is much narrower because narrow is the way and narrow is the gate that leads to salvation. This is what he wrote in the preface of his Bible. I feel very much obliged to do the service to those of my nation according to the vocation that the Lord has called me to, the enunciation of the gospel. And he says, it seems there is no other way to complete this task than to give the New Testament in my own language.
There was one more Spanish reformer who we want to mention. He was the first Protestant martyr of Spain, and his name was Francisco San Roman. He was a clerk employed by Spanish merchants in Antwerp, Belgium, and that was part of the Netherlands at that time. At some point, San Roman was sent to Bremen in Germany to receive some payments. While he was there, he visited churches and he became acquainted with the Reformed truths about the Bible and about salvation. Here again, you come in contact with the Bible, you come in contact with truth.
Yeah. When Francisco Roman got back to Antwerp, he testified about his new faith and he was arrested. When the friars started to burn his Bible, he went ballistic, so much so that they thought he was crazy and they put him in a dungeon where he was left for 8 months. When he was released, he started spreading the gospel message again. And this time he was arrested, he was sent to Spain, and he died there at the hands of the Inquisition in 1544, being burned alive.
The Spanish Inquisition was violent. After torturing their prisoners, the ones that were condemned to die were paraded through the streets in a procession which they called an act of faith. In the early morning, with church bells ringing, a solemn procession would take place in front of crowds of people. Each of the people who attended had been promised a 40-day indulgence, meaning the sins of their past 40 days would have been forgiven if they just came to watch this spectacle. What a disgrace.
Yeah, men, women, and children would come, many from rural villages. The macabre parade starts in the dungeons where the Inquisition has horribly tortured its victims. It follows a specific order as it parades out. First, a band of soldiers to clear the way, then a standard bearer carrying the red silk banner of the Spanish Inquisition. This is followed by a number of priests, accompanied by a boys' choir behind them. The prisoners, every one of which is guarded by 2 soldiers and accompanied by 2 monks. After the prisoners comes the local governors and the politicians, followed by noblemen of the area on horseback, then more priests, and then more monks.
The prisoners would walk in a certain order and they were dressed differently than each other. Those who were suspected of having erred in just a slight degree walked at the head and they were clothed in black. The other prisoners wore a bright yellow garment called a San Benito. So it was a yellow garment. Sometimes it had red flames painted on it, pointing downward. Now, these prisoners had confessed to heresy, and though they were still going to be burned, they had received the privilege to be strangled beforehand. Those who were Sanbenitos that had red flames pointing upward hadn't confessed to heresy, and they were going to be burned alive.
Charles V's son, Philip II, became King of Spain in 1556, and he was especially fanatic in persecuting Protestants in the countries that he ruled and beyond that. At one point, he even invaded Holland with an army, killing thousands of innocent people in the Dutch cities to try to force them back to Roman Catholicism.
And if King Philip sounds familiar to some of you, he was married to Mary, who was King Henry VIII's daughter, who was staunchly Catholic. And as soon as her brother Edward died, who had made England Protestant, she fought for the throne and got it and tried to make England Catholic and killed a lot of Protestants in England. She was Bloody Mary. That's why they called her that. So a few other people who deem mentioning regarding the Reformation in Spain are people like Casadora de Reina and Cipriano de Valera. Together, they translated the whole Bible into Spanish while they were in exile. The Spanish Bible was printed in 1602 in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Another is a Bible smuggler named Julian Hernandez. His efforts allowed for groups of Spanish people in various towns to gather in secret and read the scriptures to each other. There were books with Reformed teaching and Bibles that were also smuggled into Spain. Most of these had been printed in the Netherlands.
Julian Hernandez was a dwarf. He hid books in packages of lace and dresses that he brought across the border. Because the packages were sometimes larger than he was, customs officials sometimes helped him carry his load across the border. Little did they know they were helping him smuggle. He claimed it was his size that made the customs officials never suspect him. In their eyes, he was too little and too insignificant to do any harm. Because of his size, he could also sometimes hide himself in little spaces where normal-sized people could not fit. But unfortunately, he was caught, and in 1560, he was burned to death. On the day of his execution, he just encouraged his fellow sufferers.
Chris, I can't help but think of Ehud, one of the judges, who was left-handed and partially lame, and they thought he was too insignificant for God to use.
Yeah.
For about 50 years, the seeds of the Reformation were planted in Spain, and much of the seed germinated people who were saved, especially members of the nobility and the educated classes who could read the Bible. From about the end of 1520 until 1570, the Reformation grew rapidly. But towards 1570, the Inquisition was successful in effectively exterminating the Protestant Reformation from Spain. Many adherents to the Reformation fled the country to find safety in Holland, England, and France. By then, Queen Elizabeth was in England and Protestantism was back. Others were forced to recant and yielded to the immense pressure that was put on them. Others chose to die instead of denying Jesus as Lord and Savior. They were heroes of the faith.
They were. One last place we want to mention today because of its overwhelming suppression of Protestantism is Portugal. Since the 1520s, Lutheran ideas were spreading and thought of as a threat to the Roman Church because of its spread in various parts of Europe. And the fact that it was known that Martin Luther had only laughed at a bull, which is a papal edict threatening excommunication, that had been issued against him.
Yeah, for a while, there was no strict suppression of Reformed teachings, except a bit of suppression of certain books. But people in the city of Lisbon, Portugal, were speaking so freely about Martin Luther's ideas, some claim they acted like they were in Germany. But it didn't last. The first Lutherans were arrested in 1530. And in 1536, Flemish weaver Robert High was put on trial for Lutheranism and attempting to convert employees in his workshop to Protestantism. High recanted his faith in a public ceremony.
After the Inquisition was established there, which happened in May of 1536, a more intense wave of repression was launched against Lutheranism, Calvinism, and other Reformed movements. On December 22nd of 1536 in Evora, the first Inquisitor General heard preliminary accusations against Pedro Corte Real, a nobleman from the royal household who was convicted in 1542 for having claimed that Luther spoke truth. In 1550, there was an arrest of several teachers from the College of Arts in Coimbra who were imprisoned. In addition to that, there was William Gardiner. He was the first defendant accused of Lutheranism to receive the death penalty, and he died in 1552. All of this had a significant impact on the Portuguese society. From then on, suppression of Reformed theology just kept increasing, and the Inquisition became more and more vigilant. The repression prevented the ideas of Reformation from taking hold in Portugal, just as they did in the other two countries.
Yeah, and all three countries today are vastly Catholic, even today.
Yes.
And that's a good place to end for today. We want to give a shout out to our listeners in Cyprus, Malaysia, and Lebanon. Have a blessed day, everyone.
And give him the glory, great things